OK はい、皆さん、こんにちは。米国特許セミナー、パテントターミノロジーです。このシリーズでは、特許用語、表現などできるだけわかりやすく解説しています。講師は、米国特許弁護士であるブライアン・エプスタインさんです。今回は、ステートとステータスについて見ていきたいと思います。今回も、視聴者の方からリクエストいただきました。ステートとステータスは、状態の訳として、ほぼ自動的に使用されることが多いんですが、このような訳ですね、状態とくればステートと訳す。こういった訳についての注意点をブライアンさんにご解説いただきます。Okay, Brian さん、we received a question about state and status. Please share your thoughts.
Sure. So first, I'd like to thank our viewer that asked this question. It really assists us in knowing how to provide good content, as well as provides us some content to keep this going. So my understanding is that Japanese patent specifications frequently use the word jotai, and that commonly this word is almost automatically translated as state or status, such as on state. And before we start addressing, how to translate that, we need to kind of walk through some U.S. practice. So U.S. claim elements are best defined in two ways. The first way is structurally, and by that I mean, what those elements are. And the second way is functionally, and by that I mean what these elements do. And so it's kind of a strange way to set this forth, because what else is there, right? Well, a common mistake is that applicants sometimes try to define elements by their attributes or their characteristics. And by that, I mean, attributes like dynamic or real time. Those are distinguishable from attributes like, 83% calcium or a resistance of 15 kiloohms. When we talk about, a percentage of calcium or a resistance value, those are structural. Pardon me. Whereas when we talk about something like, dynamic or real time or, these kinds of attributes, those are just kind of things that particular elements have. They're just characteristics of them. And in my experience in, the mechanical, the electrical, the software technologies, applicants seldom are successful in defining elements by their attributes or characteristics. I've done some chemistry cases. I haven't seen this there. Maybe it's successful there, but I don't think it is. I think it's just a ineffective claim drafting practice. So when we talk about things like century state, that's probably not an industry standard. This one was taken from a car as a century state. Something like an on state might have some sort of industry standard, but we see this a lot where there's different modes that are described in the claims or patent application. And if it's not an industry if it is an industry standard, then that's structural, right? We know what that is. It has a structure. It must conform to this industry standard. If it's not an industry standard, then we don't really know what that is. And in this situation, the claim must also define this state functionally. And I say the word also here because it's probably not sufficient merely to recite transitioning into or from the century state, right? On its own, entering the sentry state or leaving the sentry state doesn't mean anything. Therefore, typically we would want a second recitation in the claim that defines what occurs in the sentry state. And so now we are functionally defining the sentry state, what this means, what operations are performed, how does the car enter it, what is the significance of it, what functionality does the sentry state provide to the car, some sort of monitoring or something, I assume. All right. So having kind of gotten that out of the way, let's talk about state and status a little bit more. So some practitioners say that the use of the term state sometimes makes a sentence or a claim element unnecessarily long and difficult to understand. And so as an example of this, we have this recitation of rod X extends along rod Y in a state in which rod X is out of contact with rod Y. And does that mean that rod X extends along rod Y with rod X out of contact with rod Y? These sentences or features are very similar. I've highlighted the difference in these two recitations, right? So the first one's got its differences in yellow. The second statement has its differences in green. And so we're wondering, does this mean the same thing? And the answer is no. A skilled litigator would probably argue that this translated claim, this, shorter version is, the longer version is narrower. And then the question is why, right? And the reason is that these additional words must mean something. If the applicant had wanted the feature to merely be, sorry, my mouse is acting strange here. If the applicant had merely wanted it to say rod X extends along rod Y with rod X out of contact with rod Y, right, the second one, then that's how the applicant would have claimed it. If the applicant instead claims this longer phrase using the term, in a state in which, we presume that the applicant did that out of choice. And therefore, these additional words in the claim must mean something. This is a common practice in prosecution. It applies to litigation as well. And so the logical question then is, well, okay, what do they mean? And the fact of the matter is I don't know. It's fact specific. And it's not just fact specific about the patent application being considered, or at that point an issued patent. It's also fact specific in terms of what the accused infringer's product looks like. And the reason is that this hypothetical litigator will develop a meaning for these additional words that allows the accused infringer to escape infringement. Okay, so it's fact specific on their product as well, because the whole reason that they're making this argument is that they want to escape liability for, potentially infringing the claims of this issued patent. So, we're still doing prosecution. We are, in effect, pre-litigating this kind of these claims. We're troubleshooting for our applicant. And so the recommendation is amending the claim as set forth at the top of this slide, where we amended to say that rod X extends along rod Y, comma, rod X out of contact with rod Y. Sometimes, people will use being out of contact. That's fine too. But we definitely don't want to use this phrase in a state in which, because again, it's going to create avenues for litigators to argue that that this state, this jotai, has some additional meaning that prevents this litigator's client from infringing these claims. And so what we're kind of talking about here in terms of translation theory is that functional, for example, dynamic equivalence in translation is probably okay for Paris applications. We don't necessarily need some formal equivalence where, every word in the source material is translated as faithfully as possible into the target language. Instead, we can, translate the meaning so that the effect of the translation is the same on the readers of the target language as in the source language, right? We don't need formal equivalence for Paris applications. When we get into PCT applications, I don't know that I've ever seen anything clearly taking a position as to whether formal equivalence is required. But I would definitely err more on the side of formal equivalence there. It's supposed to be the same application in every language. And, my concern would be that when we start getting into this kind of like functional equivalence, where we take out phrases like in a state in which, then it's not quite the same application, right? It's a little bit more concise. So that's our recommendation for today on state and status. Try not to use them. Oops, like this.
はい、ブライアンさん、ありがとうございました。今回はステートとステータスについて、詳しく解説いただきました。今回はこれで以上になります。ご質問や扱ってほしいトピックなどがありましたら、YouTube のコメント欄に書いていただくか、スライド最後に記載のメールアドレスまでお気軽にご連絡ください。では本日もありがとうございました。失礼します。